We're going to get the info now that we're clear that not all Europeans were white. There was many so-called black Europeans, and a lot of these were the ones getting caught in this indenture middle passage, this involuntary or voluntary middle passage, prisoners of war, convicts, colonization, you know. All right. So let's get on with the info.
All right, so now I want to get into this book. It's called, well, it's written by Bernard Balin. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author of Voyages to the West. And this particular book we're getting into is called The Barbarous Years, The Peopling of British North America, The Conflict of Civilizations, 1600, 1675. So what I did is I bought the Kindle version because they don't show you any preview of it and it's hard to get anywhere. So, thanks to your donations, I'm able to get the stuff. So we begin here. It says the third group of Anglo-Dutch religious radicals to settle in Virginia was initially the most tragic. All right, so what are they talking about? So Anglo-Dutch religious radicals, these are indentured servants, most of them. Of the 180 passengers from the embattled Elder, Francis Blackwell led from Amsterdam to Virginia. No fewer than 130, including Blackwell himself, died on that voyage of 7 months. They had been packed together, it was reported, like herrings. They had amongst them the flux and also want of fresh water. So as it is here, London wondered at that so many are alive, then that so many are dead. All right, so again, they were what? Packed together like herrings. Talking about people packed in ships. We ain't talking about Africans. Or if you want to talk about a slave ship and people, a middle passage, right? So you got to include these people too. And they all died too. Now, were all these white people? That's the debate. They're talking about Anglo-Dutch religious radicals. That doesn't talk about complexion right there. Continuing down here, it says the horror of Blackwell's notorious voyage was only an extreme example of the miseries of the transportation and resettlement process of those years. For most of the voyagers, emigration was a shocking experience. For some, it was as deadly as it was for Blackwell's pilgrims. The Virginia Company published guidelines for the supplies necessary for such voyages, but did nothing to enforce them, with the result that the provisions on board were so poor that they became a subject of complaint to the Privy Council. The voyages of these small, ill-equipped rocking vessels lasted 2 or 3 months. Food and drink were bad, stinkish beer in quality and short in quantity. Sanitation was primitive, and sickness swept through the passengers like deadly storms. So, you hear this? Each year, each shipping season, many died at sea. Most of the carefully recruited iron workers were lost on a single voyage. Okay, we're not talking about Africans here in this moment. The survivors were so weakened by disease and exhaustion that they quickly fell victim to debilitating attacks of dysentery and other afflictions. Whole shiploads that had been sent over to work on various public enterprises had to be transferred to whatever private plantations would take them, simply to assure their survival. You hear this? And the guest houses of which Sandy spoke so happily did not exist. Only one building, 40 feet by 20, is known to have been built for that purpose. And so, since it is mortal for newcomers to lie on the ground, the hundreds of new arrivals had to be added to the crowds that already filled the small, flimsy dwellings that were being hastily constructed. Even that might have been tolerable if the timing of the voyages had been right, but despite bitter protests from Virginia, the vessels typically left England early in the spring and arrived at the worst possible time, at the beginning of the hot season and before the year's harvest had come in. So they would send these people right when it was time to actually gather the harvest and go, go into winter. They actually needed these people more. It would be more logical to send them during the springtime when they're planting so they can help out, right? Partake in the work and get their fruits from it. That's The constant, often unexpected arrivals of shiploads after shipload of sickly, disoriented passengers in a climate that was debilitatingly hot and humid, lacking supplies to carry them over the first phase of resettlement, destined to be housed in crowded huts until they could be distributed, often to places other than their intended destinations. All of this brought repeated outcries from the resident leaders. I pray, Sir Governor George Yearly, 1618-21, wrote Sandys, give me both time to provide means and to build and, and settle before you send one load after another. Stop sending these ships, they're telling him, man. Give us some time. We're talking about ships after ships, right? Shipload after shipload. I'm not talking about slave ships from Africa here. I'm talking about Europeans coming as indentured servants, convicts, undesirables, right? But let's not forget all this. We continue in chapter 5 of this book, and right here it says the English, who both repelled and attracted the Indians as they probed their exposed borders, continued to lead fragile, disordered lives in an unfamiliar, dangerous environment, pressing against threatening people no less disoriented and fearful than themselves. The settlers were still sheltered in a small, lightly built, dirt-floored dwellings, scattered haphazardly amid crudely cultivated stump-filled tobacco fields and cattle farms, some with produce gardens, small fields of corn and other crops, cut out of Indian hunting grounds. Most of them were servants, slaves. All right, parentheses, you see that? Most of them what? Were servants. These settlers, these English, these were slaves. They were frequently called working off their indentures. They were working off what? Their indentures. They were what? Servant slaves, often side by side with their masters, hoping eventually to acquire a parcel of tobacco land of their own or return to their original homes. It says the African among them, oh, that's the hijack. All right, the reason I say that is because when was this written? In 2012, published. So they're going to add the African in there when they're talking about people of color. It says the African among them, 23 and 1625, because there's no record of any Africans in six. Show me slave voyages. Go to slavevoyages.org right now and show me any African in 1625, a ship, and bringing in any Africans in 1625. You won't find that. It says they were of indeterminate legal status since they had no contracts. And their social status, though the base was unclear. So wait a minute. They have no contracts and you don't know their status. So you can't say they're a slave because you don't know. It's unclear. They have no contracts. They sound like free people of color to me. That's what they sound like to me. If it's unclear, and this has scholarly footnotes, right? This book is very scholarly. His sources are very scholarly. You can follow up on that if you like. All right? They don't know. It's unclear. So again, drop nation. If they can't tell you who you are, how can they tell you who you're not? The social order as a whole in the struggling colonies' pell-mell scramble for survival and profits was chaotic. We continue on page 80 of this book. It says these large quantities of tobacco were not produced on the company's land, and the laborers necessary to produce these crops were not as originally planned employees of the Virginia Company. They were contract workers on an increasing number of private plantations created by the company new land policy and tenant farmers of absentee landowners assisted by indentured servants. All right, indentured servants. All right, that's who by 1617 a model structure had emerged. All right, they had the plan, they had the blueprint. We need to do this with indentured servants. We're going to get them from the undesirables and the convicts we don't want and all those poor people we don't want over there. Adventurers do land for their investments began to pool their grants to create larger and more efficient units of production. Smith's Hundred, founded that year, which combined the land claims of leading figures in the company, became a virtual colonizing company of its own, financed by a terminable joint stock and complete with a private labor force of indentured servants, a private labor force of indentured servants, not African slaves. We're talking about plantations, we're talking about tobacco plantations, indentured servants. And this included also American Aboriginal Indians they were bringing in from the Caribbean and local ones they had already put into servitude and indenture. right? So when they show us these tobacco fields with so-called Negroes, growing it, it's not Africans. This was done with indentured servants. So dodge the hijack. This is real history. All right, so now we're on page 130. We're going to talk about the passengers on this ship, the Ark and the Dove. All right, it's about 1634. We're going to go to the next page. It talks about the list. It says the rest of the passengers, most of them Protestants, right? Protestants. Remember, who's the Protestants? We already know. So remember, we're indentured or paid servants. So remember, when they telling us Protestant settled here, religious freedom, well, they had to find a way to get over. It wasn't like they all had money to come over, so they had to indenture themselves for the passage over here. So these Protestants were indentured or paid servants. One of them black, one of them a Protestant, one of them black. What does that mean? So-called black. One of the Protestants is black. One a Portuguese mulatto, some artisans, and a few independent farmers. Now, are we supposed to assume that this one black, supposedly one black, is an African? Dodge the hijack, right? They're letting you know something here. Two Jesuit priests, Andrew White and John Alton, and a lay brother completed the shipboard list, sharply divided between gentry and laborers, most of whom were indentured servants. The first settling group conformed reasonably well to Calvert's social expectations. 165 of this book, it says approximately 100,000 Britons, of the great majority English, are known to have migrated to the Tobacco Coast in the 17th century. All right? Britons in the Tobacco Coast, Britons, not Africans, at least 70% of them, and probably 85% came as indentured servants, 85% slaves, bonded for service. They were at work in the oldest settled areas as in the newest, arriving year after year on veritable convoys of ships from the major English ports. Middlesex County, between the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers, a contemporary road, was a sea of servants. All right, a sea of servants. We're not talking about Africans. 45% of that country's entire population were servants in 1668, and the same could have been said of other countries. Who were these tens of thousands of voluntary bonded servants? Tens of thousands, hundred thousands. Where are their descendants? This is a lot of people. Imagine. So why would they need, if they're hiring contracts, you know, why would they be doing that if they got free labor from Africans? It's a business, it's a corporation, you see? Who were the tens of thousands of voluntary bonded servants? Where were they from? And were their backgrounds? What were their backgrounds? What were the differences and similarities among them? How did they live in this strange environment? What would become of them when they were released from service? In the book says the most debased, possibly 40% of the total, were the youngest, the least skilled and most destitute. They shipped out without the protection of legal indentures and served therefore according to the harsh terms of extemporized contracts that followed Virginia's local custom. All right, we're on page 308 of this book, and this part is talking about Irish travails in Fort Christina, a settlement renamed to Altona, and it says that the population about 600 souls, many of them rough people, as poor as worms and lazy withal. Only a few of them qualified farmers, fell victim to the damp climate made more miserable by a sequence of heavy rains that ruined the winter fodder. A hot intermittent fever and dysentery became epidemic. About 100 people, many of them children, died, and the diseases were compounded by the arrival of 108 more settlers on the mill. So on top of what they were going through, they were dumping more convicts, more people with disease, more people undesirables on top of them. All right, 11 of whose companions had succumbed to scurvy on the passage, 3 of whom died on landing. The survivors, especially the indentured orphan children, indentured, taken from Amsterdam's almshouses, were suffering from a variety of illnesses, some contagious, and they brought with them no supplies. But recruitment continued in Finland and especially in the farming districts of Gelderland and Holland. All right, we're talking about Dutch, German, Finnish people, indentured servants too. These type of Europeans, not just English, Scottish, or Irish. Remember, all of Europeans we're bringing over here.
Robert Drake.